Life for medieval nobles inside castles was anything but serene. While stories of grand feasts, knights in shining armor, and courtly romance do have some truth, day-to-day reality involved a mix of luxury, violence, and responsibility. Castles were more than homes. They were fortresses, political hubs, and symbols of power where danger and decadence lived side by side. Lords and ladies not only indulged in extravagant banquets, but also navigated complex alliances, revolts, and at times, outright bloodshed. This video takes you inside the walls of these medieval powerhouses, revealing the events that define castle life for the upper class. Let's break down what life looked like beyond the banquet hall. The banquet hall inside a castle was a scene for some of the wildest, most chaotic displays of power. These feasts could go from lavish celebration to political disaster in the blink of an eye. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, entire boars glazed in honey, and delicacies like peacock served with its feathers still intact. Every guest, from visiting nobles to knights fresh from the battlefield, knew that what they ate and where they sat determined their social standing. One slip up at the wrong place could turn a noble family's fortunes upside down. Tension simmered beneath the surface. A cupbearer presenting a goblet of imported wine might slip in poison as smoothly as a compliment. Feasts weren't just social gatherings, they were battlegrounds where rivalries boiled over. On a bad day, insults tossed back and forth between neighboring lords could trigger a duel before the meal ended. Weapons were never far from reach. It wasn't uncommon for one of these events to end with overturned tables, broken benches, and at least one nobleman carried off unconscious, or worse. If a rival lord got a little too ambitious, the castle guards lurking nearby would haul him off, sometimes straight to the dungeon below the feast hall. Even without weapons drawn, these events were performances of power. The sheer size of the feast, dozens of dishes served to hundreds of people, was meant to show strength. It wasn't enough to feed guests, they needed to be overwhelmed. When the food started running low or tempers flared, musicians played louder, drowning out arguments while dancers spun wildly across the stone floor. Behind the scenes, kitchen staff raced to prepare more platters. Any delay could embarrass the lord in front of his guests. And embarrassment could lead to something worse, an excuse for a vassal to rebel or a neighbor to seize disputed land. Once the feast ended, the real games began. When the torches dimmed and the wine flowed freely, dangerous conversations filled the halls. Noblemen whispered in dark corners, forging alliances or plotting betrayals. Meanwhile, lords kept one eye on their guests and the other on the wine pitchers. The only thing worse than a guest overstaying their welcome, a vassal growing bold enough to challenge the host's authority by morning. When a siege began, life inside the castle turned into a slow, grinding nightmare. Gates slammed shut, and archers scrambled to the battlements. Families huddled while soldiers armed themselves with crossbows and swords. Outside, enemy forces prepared to starve the defenders out. Siege engines rumbled across the fields, catapults loaded with rocks, dead livestock, or barrels of disease. If the attackers could breach the gates, blood would flow. The defenders, knowing the stakes, fought dirty. They dumped boiling oil on attackers scaling the walls, set fire to wooden siege towers, and launched flaming arrows into enemy camps at night. They'd even fling corpses infected with plague into enemy ranks, hoping to spread sickness. Starvation set in within weeks. The granaries emptied, and the noble family's prized horses, once symbols of power, became food for survival. Even rats were not safe from desperate hands. Betrayal was a constant fear. If a spy opened the gates or a traitor signaled the attackers, the defenders would be overrun in minutes. Noble families knew that if captured, they faced execution or imprisonment. Sometimes defenders would negotiate a surrender, offering up gold, hostages, or strategic land to buy their lives. But negotiations could fail, and when they did, it was brutal. Castles that fell by force were often put to the torch. Survivors, if there were any, were dragged off in chains. When supplies ran dangerously low, defenders resorted to terrifying measures. There are stories of noble families suffocating their own servants to stretch rations. Others packed villagers into the outer walls, hoping the attackers would slaughter them first. On rare occasions, desperate defenders snuck through hidden tunnels beneath the castle, staging ambushes in the dead of night. A few succeeded, slipping behind enemy lines to burn their siege engines or assassinate commanders in their tents. But most of these attempts ended with knights dragged back to the castle, broken and bloodied, or thrown over the walls to send a message to the defenders. There would be no escape. Each day stretched endlessly. The weight of survival pressed down on everyone, from the lord's family to the lowest servant. They counted arrows, rationed bread, and prayed for reinforcements that might never come. And when the castle walls finally cracked, Mercy was as rare as food. A noble family's power depended as much on loyalty as it did on fear, and loyalty was always for sale. Life in a castle could shift in a heartbeat, with alliances forged over wine and broken by sunrise. Lords and knights knew that betrayal wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. Even the most trusted advisors were suspects, always watching for the slightest misstep that could create an opening for personal gain. Castles echoed with whispers of treachery, secret plots hatched in the darkest corners of stone corridors. Some betrayals played out quietly, with poison slipping into goblets or daggers tucked beneath cloaks. Others erupted into full-blown revolts. Family members turned on each other over disputes about inheritance, calling in mercenaries to storm the gates and wrest control. Political marriages, meant to solidify alliances, often led to violent conflict. A husband might accuse his wife of infidelity, sometimes to get rid of her without scandal, sometimes to provoke a war with her powerful relatives. These accusations didn't stop at words. A public trial could end with an execution if the verdict swayed in favor of the accuser. Even servants were dragged into these games. A lowly maid overheard the wrong conversation and found herself bribed into silence, or worse, interrogated until she named names. Spies, disguised as messengers and merchants, slipped through castle gates to gather information. If caught, they faced gruesome deaths in front of jeering crowds. One lord ordered a captured spy nailed to the castle gate as a warning, leaving him to die in agony while the residents of the keep walked past his rotting corpse. Guard duty near the dungeons wasn't safe either. Prisoners lured guards into conversations, promising gold or titles in exchange for freedom. Some guards, foolish enough to fall for these promises, were caught mid-escape and dragged to the dungeon themselves, swapping places with the prisoners they tried to release. A noble imprisoned in his own castle knew that every conversation, every gift, and every gesture carried a risk. Allies could become enemies in an instant, and those who survived the longest did so with a constant hand on the hilt of their swords, trusting no one completely. Noble life was a constant performance. Nothing showcased that performance better than tournaments. Jousts were staged battles where knights thundered across fields on war horses, crashing into each other with sharpened lances. Spectators cheered as splintered wood flew through the air. But these events were anything but games. Knights rode to win, both glory and favor, and they didn't mind if a few ribs snapped in the process. Horses collided, riders flew to the ground, and onlookers gasped as medics hauled away unconscious competitors. Knights knew that losing too many jousts could ruin their reputation, but a victory could land them lucrative contracts or an invitation to serve in a powerful lord's court. Hunting expeditions were just as dangerous. Nobles rode through dense forest, hounds barking at their sides, chasing down wild boars that could gore a man in seconds. The thrill wasn't in the kill, it was in surviving the pursuit. Riders who were thrown from their horses risked being trampled or left behind. On more than one occasion, a careless hunter found himself impaled on the tusk of his prey, his cries of pain swallowed by the sounds of the chase. Lords treated these hunts as much-needed breaks from castle politics, but the risks of the wilderness were real. For those who survived the hunt, the rewards were grand. The spoils, fat boars and swift deer, became centerpieces for extravagant feasts. Skins and antlers decorated the castle walls, marking victories and giving nobles stories to boast about long after the hunts ended. But the danger never truly faded. Rival nobles used these expeditions to lure enemies into vulnerable situations. There were stories of hunters returning without one of their companions, whispering that the forest had taken them, though everyone knew a rival lord's men had ensured he wouldn't return. Even downtime in the castle had an edge to it. Sword training could easily escalate into real combat, with bruises and blood left on the practice field. Lords demanded that their knights remain sharp, ready to fight without warning. Even when no lords loomed on the horizon, every banquet, hunt, and tournament carried the threat of violence. Religion governed nearly every corner of castle life, and the chapel wasn't simply a quiet refuge for prayer. It was where politics, power, and fear converged. Nobles treated faith like insurance, donating land and gold to monasteries in exchange for prayers that would secure their place in heaven. These acts weren't entirely selfless. In a world where death could arrive through war, disease, or betrayal, securing the favor of saints and priests felt like a matter of survival. Lords who funded grand chapels or endowed abbeys were not only buying salvation, they were establishing a legacy, etching their names into history alongside martyrs and kings. The clergy within the castle weren't passive spiritual guides. Priests wielded influence over both the residents and the surrounding peasantry. Their sermons dictated how peasants behaved, ensuring taxes were paid and revolts smothered before they began. When rebellion stirred in the countryside, Lords relied on priests to remind the people that their suffering was part of a divine plan. Any defiance against the nobility was treated as a sin against God himself, and those bold enough to challenge authority were dragged before both priests and soldiers for swift, brutal judgment. But devotion also had its darker moments. Nobles obsessed over their souls, haunted by the blood they spilled and the enemies they crushed. When lords returned from war, they often built new chapels within their walls, each dedicated to a saint who would wash away the stains of their conquest. The most devout even went as far as financing entire monastic orders to pray for their family souls long after they were dead and buried. Castles often had multiple chapels, each more fancy than the last, filled with relics that were said to hold miraculous powers, bones of saints, scraps of holy cloth, and fragments of relics carried back from distant lands. These treasures became symbols of divine favor and were guarded as fiercely as the castle's walls. In times of crisis, faith was a final weapon. Besieged castles saw nobles kneel side by side with peasants, begging for miracles to deliver them from starvation or plague. When all else failed, when armies closed in and betrayal festered within, lords placed their last hope in the will of God, praying that the priest had not lied about heaven's mercy. Thanks for watching Nutty Productions. What else do you want to learn about medieval times? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, share this video with a friend, and all that good stuff to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.